but he is here from Synod, Don Duberstein in the back. He works with discipleship for the Synod, so works at the Synod office. I've known Don since, he'll tell you stories of when I was a kid. We'd go to, in Kansas, when I was in Kansas City, and we'd shoot bottle rockets at each other, me and my brothers. And he was a pastor nearby, so he's known me since I was this high, getting into trouble with my brothers. So, and then Joel Gaertner. Say that right? Gaertner. I said it. I always get the name Gaertner. Joel Gaertner is going to help do our presentation today. On your handout, you'll see kind of the order of how things are going. Kind of break up the different sections. There'll be a bigger handout kind of summarizing everything later, and then some questions where you can give feedback afterwards, but that'll be handed out afterwards. So this is just for you to take some notes, and you can write your thoughts down. After you go through everything, we'll have about 30 minutes of questions and answers. So, and then at that time, there's some mics in the back, and we can hand those around too. We'll use the mics just so that everyone can hear you. The other reason we're going to use mics is we are recording this. We know that this is kind of a vacation time, so there's a lot of people that want to be here that are probably somewhere down in the south, Mexico and Florida in the warm weather. So part of that is there's being recorded, so we want Joel's going to be mic'd up, and then your questions will be mic'd up as well. So with that, we praise God for this opportunity, and know whatever God decides, whatever we decide as congregations, that God's going to continue to bless our ministry. So with that, we thank Joel, and we thank all of you for being here for this discussion. So,
morning, everyone. I see you're all a bunch of good Lutherans sitting as close to the back as you can, so that's a good thing. So when he talks about coming back from vacation, I'm excited to be here, but I actually, Pastor John Hine, who is the Director of Congregational Services and does congregational consulting, emailed me a couple weeks ago and said, oh, by the way, I'm double booked on March 9th. Can you take this presentation? And it took a little bit of convincing to convince my wife to leave Florida early on Thursday to come back. But when we didn't have any sun and it wasn't going to be much above 70 degrees, she goes, let's just go. So the other thing about this is very interesting. 6 weeks ago, I was actually on the other side of the microphone. My wife and I are members of one of 7 churches on the south side of Milwaukee that are having the exact same conversation. So understand, this is a conversation that is literally going on all around the Synod. You're going to be surprised at this. There are 24 of these conversations that are taking place in one phase or another across the Synod. So thank you for being willing to have the conversation. I just want to make one introductory comment. Understand, and we're going to talk about it near the end, this is the first of 3 phases in the Merged for Mission program. This is what's called the exploratory phase. You are going to get a whole bunch of information this morning. That's why I'm glad that you're going to get the handout at the end. There's going to be a whole bunch of information about different things to think about. So the exploratory phase, what happens after this is then you go back in your congregations, in your homes, and discuss it, and then you decide, hey, where do we want to go from here? And I'll talk about phases 2 and 3 later on as we get in. So here's a roadmap of where we're going to go this morning. We have 5 objectives, and number 1 is most important. I'll tell you, in every one of these conversations, people understand this is something that we should be talking about. And sometimes we get distracted because of other things. We need to always keep our eye on the mission of the church. Another big thing is to understand this is not just a conversation that is happening in WELS. This is something that is happening in every Christian church body across the country. The third one, and this is a big thing to talk about, and I think that it's probably part of the conversation between the 2 congregations that are leading this, is critical mass. When we join forces and we have more people a part of the conversation, are there things that we can do better together? We're going to talk about the various types of mergers, just so you have that on your plate, and then deliberate the next steps, and that's where I'll talk about it. The first thing to talk about with this is we use the term parish area. And parish area in 2024 is something that is a whole lot different than it was 100 or more years ago, and I'm going to get to that in a second. The stats show us that people in our country today, you think about how far you're willing to drive for work or entertainment or anything else like that. People are willing to drive 15 minutes to get to church. So let's see what that looks like. So if you put a 15-minute radius from Emmanuel and Shirley, that's where you get at. And I know your pastors have showed me some of the things that you've already talked about, but I was amazed when I look at the map, all the churches that border on that 15-minute area. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And I'm just going to make one comment about that. While the two congregations are leading it, down the road, do you talk about maybe including other congregations in this? That's why I mentioned what's happening on the south side of Milwaukee. You have 7 churches that are doing it. So is that something that you think about down the line? So there's 15 minutes from Emmanuel and Shirley, pointing out some of the other churches. You got Christ, and then you got Zion that's a part of this conversation. St. Paul's is no more. You got St. John's and Maribel on there as well. So then you also go 15 minutes from Zion and Morrison. The thing on the left is not correct. It's 15 minutes from Zion. So that's what that includes there. Pointing out other churches, you've got Emmanuel there. You got St. John's and Maribel. You got St. John's, St. James and Reedville, Trinity and Brillion, and that type of thing. So most of you are probably aware of that, but just to put that in front of you, is that something that is part of the bigger conversation down the line? You all know 7 miles, 10 minutes between the two churches. That gives you a little bit better picture of where all the churches are. John Hine, who is the Director of Congregational Consulting, Don will tell you, John is a stat junkie. So you're going to get every possible stat to help you look at this thing this morning. Parish area forecast, where you look at where you're at today and where things are projected to be in 2023. Moderate growth for both areas. Phase of life growth, looking at folks getting to retirement age, that doesn't really change at all. Average age forecast is only going to go up by 1 year in 10 years, so you folks aren't going to get any older in 10 years. You're good with that. This is the big thing about churches closing. Remember I talked about how far people were willing to go. Why do we have so many churches in this area? You think back to the horse and buggy days, WELS culture was shaped by the prevalence of rural farming churches. And people were maybe willing to go 2 to 3 to 4 miles. So that's why you look at, not just in your area, but all across the Midwest, why you've got churches every 2, 3, 4 miles. In early WELS history, the mindset was, instead of let's go to another church, why don't we just start a new one? And then here's an interesting one, and I've actually seen several cases of this. Because of sin, there are some spite churches. I know of several. Think about this. When you've got 2 WELS churches in the exact same block, there's one, and I'm not going to tell you where it is, there's one situation where you have 2 WELS churches where their properties literally abut. And the members will tell you, there are stories of we're going to start a new church because I don't like the people and that type of thing. So sin always plays its ugly way into this. That's just part of history. It's something we have to deal with. Another stat, 2% versus 33%. The 2% is the current situation. When you look at all the WELS churches across the U.S. right now, we are touching 2% of the population. If we start talking about some consolidations, remember what I said at the beginning, for the good of the mission of the church, we could be touching on 33% of the American population. We're going to talk about mission in just a minute here. So let's get to the mission. Good old participation. I'm not going to do this all by myself. So we're going to read a couple Bible passages together to get the idea of mission in front of us. Let's read together the words of Joshua 22, verse 3. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your fellow Israelites, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you. So you see there, the mission that God gave you, that's what Joshua is putting in front of God's people. Samuel, let's read those verses together. Samuel said, the Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. If you look at mission used in both of those, but very different purposes. Let's go to Acts, New Testament, Saul and Barnabas. Let's read that together. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. So you know the whole thing with Saul and Barnabas taking John Mark along on a gospel mission. Three missions portrayed in the pictures on the right-hand side. You've got the Apollo mission, you've got a military mission, and then you've got a mercy mission there. Think about what those all have in common. They were temporary responsibilities. When we went to the moon, we didn't stay there forever. We went there to explore, figure out what it was, and came back and that type of thing. But the bigger thing, typically mission is not something where we say, I'm going to go and do it myself. It is something handed down by someone in authority. And when you think about the church's mission, that's where we see it. Difference between mission and purpose. Mission is temporary. Purpose, the timeless essential function bestowed by the Creator, the ultimate intention for which something was made. What's our enduring purpose as long as we take breath here on this earth? To worship our Creator in everything we do, right? You know, some people think about worship as only something we do in church. If you understand it, worship is really everything that a believer does in their lifetime. The temporary responsibility Christ has given to the church, let's talk about that. Very familiar words from Matthew 28, words restated a different way in Mark 16. We've got Luke 24 and Acts 1:8. I'm going to go to the bottom one, the Acts 1:8. Anybody pick out the key word in there that defines what our mission as Christians is? Don't be afraid to shout it out. Witnesses, right? That is really our mission. In everything that we do, whether we're witnessing as we worship in church, whether we're carrying out our job, whether we're enjoying recreation and fellowship with friends, whether we're just living out our life, our whole goal and mission is to be witnesses. Exploring this idea of mission a little bit further, some congregations choose to have a mission statement. And sometimes that's a very interesting thing, trying to put together a mission statement for a congregation. And oftentimes you have a subject, verb, object. Who does what to whom? Mission objectives, how does the verb affect the object? So what are we going to do to affect other people? A simple mission statement of the Christian church as a whole is believers proclaim the gospel to all people. Those people are the object. Our objective, to share the gospel with other people that they might grow in their knowledge of God's word and service of God and neighbor. And there you've got discipleship. We're going to get to a discussion point in just a second on that. Unbelievers, that they might come to faith in Jesus and be part of the church evangelism. So you've got those two different things that might happen with witnessing. As I witness to my fellow Christians, how can I help them grow in their faith? As I witness to those who do not yet know Jesus, can I put the gospel on their hearts that they come to faith in Jesus as their Savior? We're going to hit this point over and over again this morning. As we have these conversations, how does the mission of the church play out? And this is the challenging part right here. And how often when we make decisions, who's the first person we think about? Me, myself, and I, right? What do I want? How is this going to affect me, or do I like it? Here's the questions that we need to be asking. Is this change an attempt to better carry out the mission Christ has given us? Is this proposal well thought out? And that's one of the things we're going to talk toward the end. One of the reasons a lot of times these conversations fail or sometimes struggle is because folks get off track. They lose focus on the mission and those types of things. And if it's well thought out, what part can I play? You all thought you were coming here this morning just to hear a presentation. Guess what? You get to have discussion. Take a couple minutes with folks around you, and they don't necessarily have to be the people from your congregation. As you look at your congregation that you're a member of, do we carry out things in a balanced way? So do we equally emphasize discipleship and evangelism, or does it sometimes get tilted one way or the other? I'm going to give you 90 seconds to go on ahead and have that conversation with those who are sitting around you. And you can't just sit there. Okay, who wants to share what you thought of individually or what you discussed in your group? Do you see in your congregation balance, or do you see things going one way or another? Any volunteers, feel free to come to the mic. And they're going, I don't want to be the first one. Or if you want to sit in your chair and raise your hand and shout it out, I'm okay with that too, if you don't want to get up in front of the group. Anybody have any thoughts? Which way do you see it in your particular congregation? Are we tending more toward just taking care of things internally and helping believers grow in their faith, or how good are we doing it at reaching out?
More at reaching out, we do things in the church.
So you see a balance? No, you see more reaching out. No, you see more the other way. You need to be doing more with reaching out. Okay? If you think about it, and I think Don would tell you the same thing, that's the typical balance we see, right? More congregations tend to, and there's nothing wrong with taking care of those who are already a part of the family of believers. But I always like to say, you think about Jesus' words in the Great Commission, Matthew 28. What's the first word of the Great Commission? Go. So that's something we have to keep in mind. Are we making sure that we think about going as well as taking care of those who are currently part of the flock? Any other thoughts on that? Anything else anybody wants to share? We'll get you comfortable sharing by the time we get done here this morning. Okay, if there's nothing else right now, we'll move on because we've got plenty of things to get to. This is the thing to help us understand, not that we use it as an excuse, but when you look at the landscape of just about every major Christian church, this conversation is not unique just to WELS. So there you've got the graphs going the last 50 plus years of America's changing religious landscape, and you look at where the lines are trending. They're either staying basically stable, or a lot of them are going down. We're going to look at a couple here. Look at mainline Christian churches. Back in the 70s, 30% of the American population was somehow involved in one of those churches. Look where we're at today, 10%. And you think about that. You go back, I was born pre-1970, and you look at back, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, how going to church was something that people made a priority. Even among what people like to look at as the evangelical churches, they had a big spike, but look at how they have come back down. This is the most shocking one, and it's one that we need to be aware of. How many of you have heard of what are known as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S? Anybody heard of that? This is sadly the fastest growing group of religious people in our world today. Look at it, it's 25+%. It was maybe 5% in the 70s. This is people who say they have absolutely no religion at all. We're going to touch on how we reach those in a little bit, but I think that's a big thing to be aware of. We're going to talk about it from a couple perspectives. Unfortunately, secular humanism has become the basics for morality and ethics. Secular humanism, in a short sentence, is this: you believe what you want to, I'll believe what I want to, I don't dare tell you what to say and believe, and you don't dare tell me what to say and believe. Anybody encountered that with anybody you know? Right? And unfortunately, what we went through a couple years ago only reinforced that. We had some unfortunate circumstances in our country that, opinions radically divided people, and so we're just going to keep our mouths shut and not say anything at all. Look at the way the traditional family structure has eroded, and maybe you know that in your own family, maybe you know that in your congregation, maybe you know that in your community or something like that. You go back in the 1960s, 73% of families had two parents in the first marriage. We have to 2014, we're down to less than 50, almost down to 40%, and then you see the statistics there. I know some of this is hard to see. We tried to make it as big as possible. This whole PowerPoint is going to be made available to all of you afterwards if you want to look at it. And I say that from experience. We learned something from the presentation we did 6 weeks ago, making the PowerPoint available and having the handouts, because that was the biggest thing 6 weeks ago. Folks said, there's a lot of stuff to remember in an hour and a half. Can we have it? So we're going to share this with you. But just to understand, that's one of the effects of the way things have gone, is family structure is eroding. This is another one. Think back 30, 40 years ago, the church was part of the pillar of the community. Now folks don't want to, you talk about church at all, a lot of folks may just turn their ear. Sometimes they may start to dish you and distance themselves from you. This was, I always say, both the blessing and the curse of what came out of what we went through about 2 years ago. It's an absolute blessing in some ways, and I'll give you an example. The congregation that I belong to on the south side of Milwaukee, like every other congregation, we had been doing a little bit of online worship streaming before COVID. We upped it, and we're doing great right now. Our pastor shared with me about a year and a half ago, he said, I've got 15 shut-ins who have said, how cool is it that I can actually see my church again. I think I don't have to tell any of you the downside of it, right? I don't feel like getting up this morning, getting dressed. It's a whole lot easier just to grab my coffee, stay in my PJs, sit on the couch, and watch worship. And there's other blessings, right? I told you how I dragged my wife, not literally, but in some ways I dragged my wife back from Florida yesterday afternoon. We were in a place where we were quite a distance from any WELS congregations. Last Sunday morning, we got together with some friends of ours. We used to be part of the same congregation. We watched worship together in a live stream. Boy, how cool was that we had that? And we had how many churches to pick from, right? So think about how that can sometimes make this a challenge as well. Illogical consumption, asynchronous consumption. The asynchronous part sometimes is a blessing. You got folks who work crazy work schedules and that type of thing, and I've heard people say it's nice to be able to find a worship service when I get home from work at 10 o'clock in the evening and be able to sit down and watch it. Think about this one 30, 40 years ago. Basic Christian norms. Decent behavior, decent language, everything else like that. That used to be something that was part of everybody's DNA. Now it's almost the part of some people's DNA just to defy it, right? They want to stick your Christianity and your Christian morals in your faith. This is the reality. Notice it doesn't say America is a post-Christian nation. So it's not like Christianity is completely gone, but you go back 50s, 60s, 40s, America was a Christian nation. We've heard all the things to try to take God out of the Constitution and the pledge and everything else like that. So understand that we are working in a nation and in a society that is post-Christendom, where making God and the values that we hold is no longer a main priority. And here's an example of that. Back in 1980, 1 in 3 unchurched Americans were actively looking for a church to join. You want to see what it is these days? 1 in 30. Go back to the conversation we had a couple minutes ago. Discipleship versus evangelism. And you think about the efforts that a congregation has to reach out to people. No longer does it work where you simply put on your church sign, we have worship at 8 and 10:30 on Sunday morning, and somebody's going to go, I'm looking for a church this morning, I'm going to wander in. Very rarely is that going to happen. I'm just going to make one quick explanation here. This is something that Don and the rest of us in congregational services have talked about. The way that we are going to continue to get the gospel out and grow our congregations is each one of us, each one of the now 240-some thousand members of WELS, understanding that God has placed us in the exact place where we live for a reason. There's another presentation that John Hine gives, and he starts with a view of the U.S. He zooms into Wisconsin, he zooms into Waukesha, and then he zooms into his own address. And he will tell you all the people that live around him and how he knows the spiritual life of every single one of those people. Not that he's being nosy, but he understands that command that we read from Acts 1 earlier, you will be my witnesses. It's not on accident that you live where you do, and God has placed the people around you is not an accident either. One of the things that you're going to hear, maybe you've heard of the program Everyone Outreach. If Eric Recker were here this morning, he would talk to you about that. Instead of us handing out flyers or putting ads in the newspaper or other places, outreach today and growing the church is looking at the people that God has put around us. And how do I, first of all, build a relationship with them? And then how do I find an opportunity to witness to them? That sort of flips the script, doesn't it? think about the people that you interact with on a regular basis. Or maybe they're the people that you don't interact with. It's very interesting. My wife and I have this conversation about the folks that live around us. And we, through a number of interactions, know the situations very well. And my wife goes, why on earth did God put the guy with Lou Gehrig's who swears at me every time I walk across the street to live across from me? And I remind her, dear, he did that so that you can treat him with love and perhaps have the opportunity to share Jesus with him. Just a small example, right? But think about those types of things. So the way that we go about this is something that needs to change. You see all these things about churches closing. Now look at this one. In the time that we are going to be together this morning, there is yet another Christian church in the United States that's going to close. Is that a willful decision where they said, hey, we can find out a way to do gospel ministry better? Or is it something where they said, okay, we've only got 2 people coming, we're going to throw in the towel? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. I don't know if any of you have seen these statistics. And this is WELS statistics that show you that we are facing the exact same thing that every other Christian church in the U.S. is facing. I'm going to put the overall things up there just so that you have a better idea. So if you look at 1990, 421,396 members. That was the high watermark of membership in the WELS. That was also the last decade that we had gains. Look at 1993 to 2002. We lost 16,000 members. 2003 to 2012, we lost 22,000. The last decade, WELS has lost nearly 50,000 members. So we've gone from a church body of 421,000 to 330,000. Now look at the next 2 decades. And John Hine tells us those are the 2 decades that are going to matter the most. Are we going to keep on doing things the way we've done them, where we say we have to keep every single church open and we keep on doing ministry the exact same way we did it? Or are we going to think about things differently? If we don't change the course at all, in the next decade, we see a 40% increase in lost, where we go from 330,000 to 262,000, and in the next decade after that, we would go and become a church body of less than 179,000 members. So basically half of what we are today. Think about what that means for us as a church body. If we are a church body of only 179,000 members, can we keep on doing mission work like we're doing? It's going to be really difficult, right? Can we continue to have a 4-school ministerial education system? Can we keep open both Michigan Lutheran Seminary and Luther Prep, Martin Luther College, and Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary? Those are all things that are going to become a real challenge if we become a church body half the size of what we are right now. I'm not saying that to scare you. That's the reality, and that's why I'm thankful that you guys are having the conversation that we are having this morning. And I know, again, this is rather small. Again, you'll get the PowerPoint to be able to look at this, but percentage of WELS congregations in worship attendance categories. You go back just a little over 20 years. The blue bar at the bottom is 25 or fewer members in worship. The brown bar is 26 to 50. So that's 50 members or less in worship on a regular basis. A little over 20 years ago was 26%. Notice that in 20 years, it has almost doubled to 44% of WELS congregations have 50 or fewer members in worship on a regular basis. I'm going to show you something else in a minute. The interesting thing is, not only is that the prevalent stat, but when you've got congregations that have 50 people in worship or less on a Sunday morning, and you've got 3 or 4 of those in a 10-minute radius of each other. That's what's led to the conversation that we're having on the south side of Milwaukee. When you have literally 3 churches in a 1-mile triangle, and 2 of those churches average, one averages about 51. If they get 25 people on a Sunday morning, they're happy. And they've started having that conversation. This is another one. So the gray bar is 100 people or less in worship. Look at the stat way on the right-hand side. 73% of WELS congregations average less than 100 people in worship on a Sunday morning or on a weekend. This takes not just your 2 congregations, and I'll do some interpreting to help you figure this all out. So you've got a number of bars there. The green bar way on the top, and this is total membership. Green bar way on the top is Trinity and Brillion. The yellow bar that steps down is St. John, St. James, Reedsville. The bold blue bar that goes up, that's Zion. The smaller blue bar that's near that is St. John's in Wrightstown. The other gray bar that sort of just goes there is St. John's in Maribel. And then the rust-colored bar at the bottom is Emmanuel. So you've got the overall membership of all of those congregations. Remember I told you John Hine is a stat junkie. I think you're starting to understand that, right? But Don will tell you, the neat part about it is you never question John when he makes a point, right, Don? Because he's always got not 1, not 2, but 3, 4, or 5 stats to back it up. And he helps us understand that we realistically need to think about things, and that's what I'm hoping we can talk about this morning. The last 30 years with the 2 congregations. So you see how overall membership has gone up. Look what has happened with overall worship attendance. You had a little bit of an up, and you've had 2 decades of down, so you're basically about where you were in worship attendance 30 years ago. Remember I said you're going to have a chance to talk with each other. This, I think, is a very important one, and this is one where you do a little bit of heart searching. Besides God's grace, which is what we always live under, when you look at the 2 congregations holding steady in membership, which is better than the national and the WELS average, have there any ministries that have become more difficult, even though membership has held steady? And this is one of those key conversations to start having. Where are some areas where we say we wish we would be able to, or we might have been able to, or we used to have? That's an interesting thing with, and forgive me for keep on coming back to the 7 churches on the WELS side, south side of Milwaukee, but I'm going to share one stat with you. One of the pastors, the morning after we had this presentation 6 weeks ago on the south side of Milwaukee, he went back and he asked his congregation, he said, so what did you think of it? And one older lady who had been there for quite a long time said, well, I thought they were going to tell us how we could return our church to the glory days. And he goes, I tried not to snicker, but he said, I think she completely missed the point that unfortunately in some of these situations, the glory days are gone. And that's why I just laid out that whole scenario to you. This is what the hand that we're dealt and that we're playing with right now. How are we going to deal with it? So take 2 minutes, have conversations with each other. Are there some areas that you wish you could be doing or were doing that have become more difficult in the last few decades? Go on ahead. hopefully. And remember, I'm going to go back to what we talked about at the beginning. All of us here together are having this conversation because we are concerned about and want to continue to carry out the mission of Christ Church in the best way possible. So understand, because it's going to be said in a minute here, if we are going to have these conversations for the good of the kingdom, we need to understand that there is never a bad idea, and we can't be dissing what anybody else says. Anybody willing to talk about any ministries that you have seen in your congregation that have maybe become more difficult in the last decade or so? Bueller? Anyone? Go ahead.
Trying to attract younger people.
Okay, getting younger people, yeah.
Retain them.
Yeah, either getting them in or keeping them in. Okay, that's a great one. We're going to get to that in a second. And I think that's not unique to this area. Every congregation will tell you trying to get young people in or keeping them as a member of your congregation is a challenge. Any others that anybody wants to share with the greater group? Yes, sir.
It used to be the rural area in which the sons bought farms near, and of course they go to the church that they came from. Well, now those are consolidated, and you've got people from rural or urban coming out to the country to use that home, and they don't have the contact with the families in the community anymore.
Okay, so you've lost that whole family generation concept, and I think we all understand that. Where are the younger people going? They're going into the cities, right? They're looking for higher paying jobs or more steady jobs or something else like that. Any others that you discussed that anybody would like to share with us? Two great ones so far. We're going to actually come back to especially the first one more in a minute here. Going once. Going twice. We'll get you all to be comfortable talking in front of each other by the time we get done.
Also, they were talking about how the loss of the school at Emmanuel Shirley has had a significant impact on there.
The idea of Christian education. Great one to talk about. That's something that it's interesting in almost every conversation. You talk about that, so you're talking about losing in one school. And again, I'm just going to help you understand, this is a conversation that's helping going on all across the country. The 7 congregations on the south side, there are 4 schools among the 7 congregations. Talk about a difficult conversation, right? But I'll tell you, it's interesting when you look at this in terms of mission. The conversation has happened already. Does the one school end up getting closed, or do they go with somebody else? And do the other 3 schools become one school with 3 different campuses? And I'll help you understand that quickly. The 3 different campuses, all 3 schools will acknowledge none of us are doing well, and none of us have the facilities to consolidate everything in one place. So this is the conversation that's happening. Do we have early childhood on one campus? Do we have 1 to 4 on another campus? Do we have 5 to 8 on another campus? Guess what the challenge is? You've got about 2 miles between, you've got a 2-mile distance. So people are going, okay, if I got a kid in early childhood and upper grades, and we've talked about transportation and those types of things, but that's one of the things, don't let any of that hold back the conversation right now. I'm going to show you in a minute when we get to the end.
I want to address what you just said
Yes.
about that. I, as a parent, had 2 daycares, okay? So I was going to one daycare, then I was going to another daycare,
Okay?
and then I went to work. Okay, that was back in the 80s, okay? Yes, it is 2024, but I had the same challenges as what is today. So that challenge is still there. We just have to look at it differently.
Yep. And you made it work. That's your point.
Absolutely, we made it work.
Right. Exactly.
You have,
Yeah.
you have to, and you look at it that way. You do make it work.
Yeah. Great point. Thank you. Okay, let's move on because we got a lot more to talk about yet this morning. If you didn't realize, what you were just talking about led to this point right here. Critical mass. Are we looking at capacity, or are we looking at quantity? And how does that all play in together? I'm not a great musician, but I still understand this one. How easy is it to play an orchestral arrangement with only a trombone and a timpani? It sounded a little bit weak, wouldn't it? Let's get a little bit more practical example. What is it like playing backyard football, where you throw the ball up to yourself and you catch it and then your sibling tries to tackle you? That's pretty boring, right? It's a lot more fun when you have 4 and you can play 2-on-2. What's even better than that? When you can have the whole neighborhood playing together. We joke all the time. My wife and her siblings talk about the glory days of their neighborhood. And our one sister-in-law and I joke, we go, oh, here we go, another one of those stories. We know that they're, fond memories and that type of thing, but think about that. When you could have every kid in the neighborhood doing something together. In the old thing, what do people say? Well, back then we didn't have one of these. You knew that when the street light went on, it was time to go home. Or in our case, my kids knew their mom's whistle for them, and that meant you better get your butt home and that type of thing. Couple other examples. So now let's take and apply this to the church. How does it affect ministry when at a good service the sanctuary is 20% full? So you walk in on a Sunday morning and only 1/5 of the pews are filled, and those 50 or less people are scattered all throughout the sanctuary. Probably not the most inviting or encouraging to a guest, is it? Or when there are 4 grades to a room in the elementary school. I just smile at that one because my first 3 years of Christian education were not 4 in a room. We had all 9 grades, K through 8, in the exact same room. We had a lower grade table up in the front and an upper grade table. The lower grade table was lower, the upper grade table was higher. Guess what was the badge of honor when you got to move from the lower grade table to the upper grade table? But again, and I think about that, that was the second Lutheran elementary school I went to was about the exact same thing. We did not have enough boys and girls to have a separate boys and girls basketball team. So we played co-ed, and we practiced against the parents, and my worst memory of 8th grade basketball is that my big elbows broke the nose of one of the moms that I was practicing against. Let's get to the one in the lower left. 2/3 of the kids in Sunday school are the pastor's children. Or maybe all the kids in the Sunday school are the pastor's children, right? Or the one in the lower right, somebody talked about young people, and this is a reality. And I'm going to pause for a second and have Don talk about where he was last night. But your teen group's average attendance is 2. And what about if it's one good-looking girl and one very awkward-looking young boy? How's that youth group going to go? Not really well, right? Don, you want to talk about where you were at last night with youth group?
Yeah, Morrison Lutheran High School was, they have 26 churches.
You want to come to the mic, please?
Here. I'll bring one over to you. Here you go, Don. Might be a little loud.
So with critical mass, with so many churches that are declining with either with their worship attendance or with their membership all across America. So the idea is, how do you create areas of critical mass with youth? And so Morrison Lutheran High School last night, a federation with 26 churches, they started what they call the WELS Youth Night. So that if you got 10 churches and they've got 3 teens in each of the churches that all look at each other like, I don't like you. But you put them all together, you get all the kiddie pools and put them together, you got an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and then all of a sudden, it's not weird. The kids feel normal.
How many kids did you have last night?
65.
Think about that. I love that because that's a perfect example of that. I early this morning before I left saw another picture of that, and that's one of those things where all across our synod, and it's not necessarily congregations that are talking about a merger, but it's congregations that are talking about, we recognize maybe this particular area of our ministry isn't doing the best, but if we partner with other people, we can do things a whole lot better. This is looking at it from a perspective of worship attendance and combining. So you've got Church A, sanctuary seats 180 people. Average worship attendance is 37, 21% full. Not real encouraging either to members or visitors, is it? Church B, sanctuary seats 220, average worship attendance is 41, 19% full. You know, that's again one of those where you go, okay, can everybody come up to the front? Can everybody sit on one side? Those types of things. Or Church C, sanctuary seats 145, worship attendance is 39, 27% full. Anybody want to guess what I'm going to put up on the right-hand side? Here we go. You combine 3 together at a location, so that's the one that seats 180, and you get worship attendance of 117, 65% full. You look at those 3 on the left-hand side, if you've ever been a part of one of those situations, it's difficult to get a choir, isn't it? It's difficult sometimes to get leadership positions filled and all sorts of things like that. So this is one of those benefits of critical mass where you do things together and collectively we have a better opportunity to carry out the mission that Christ has given his church. Sort of a crazy example, but you've got 6,000 pounds of boxes. And you've got 2 options to get those 6,000 pounds of boxes moved first. You get 21 80-year-old people, or you get 7 20-year-olds. I know it's sort of an absurd example, but you get the idea. You find the best way to do it, and you make things happen. So here's the possibility and practicality of congregational consulting. And remember that slide I showed you earlier, the large percentage of WELS congregations that average 50 or less in worship on a given Sunday. 460 congregations, 40%. Remember the stat I told you, there it is right in the middle. 50% of those are within 10 minutes of each other, or 230 of the just over 1,200 WELS congregations that are within 10 minutes of each other. So if we were to talk about, and remember this is all conversation, I cannot emphasize that enough. This morning we are simply exploring and understanding things that we could possibly talk about. If we were to merge 2 to 1, we would have 115 fewer congregations. If we were to join 3 to 1, we would have 153 fewer congregations. How many of you have heard a conversation about a pastor shortage within our synod? Heard a little bit about that? Okay, guess where we're going? 1990, and remember that was the heyday of WELS, 421,000 members, average weekly worshipers, total pastors 1,361. Here we are, a little over 30 years later, we are down almost 100,000 members. Our weekly worship attendance has dropped by 80,000, and we have 2 less pastors. Again, I'm not going to claim this as my own because it's something that Don and I have heard John Hine talk about any number of times. We don't have a pastor shortage. We have a deployment problem. And the challenge is, how do we have those conversations? It's interesting how this, like I said, it's going on a number of places across the synod. And sometimes the perception is, well, if we have to do this and Pastor A has to go somewhere else because we don't need 3 pastors for 2 congregations. Sometimes the perception is, well, has that pastor been a failure at his ministry? That's not it. It's circumstances and those types of things, but these are the things to look at. So we've got 2 fewer pastors than 30 years ago. We've got 22 more congregations. And there's something else that you have been hearing about for almost the last year within our church body. How many of you have heard about 100 missions in 10 years? A few of you have had. You're going to hear more and more about that. There's always the sort of challenge when that is brought up. If we have all these churches that are vacant, how can we start 100 more missions and 75 mission enhancements in the next 10 years? And this is where that whole deployment and figuring out where are we best putting our manpower and our ministry efforts, where does that all happen? Look at the bottom one. Weekly worshiper to parish pastor ratio. 30 years ago, it was 163 to 1. Now it's 92 to 1. And you understand in some congregations that 92 is almost half of that, where you've got less than 50 worshipers per parish pastor. This is the whole goal, and we've sort of been leading up to it. We talked about where are some things that maybe you had been doing well, and maybe it's been a struggle, or maybe some things that you wish you would be able to do, but they haven't happened. The whole idea of merging for mission when we come back to mission is provide wider access to the gift and skills within a congregation. I'm going to use one more example, and then we're going to dive into this in a second here. One more example from the 7 churches on the south side of Milwaukee. One thing that has evolved that none of us had an idea about, there was one congregation that I think a lot of us were shocked to know was really struggling. And then we heard this statistic that they, on their council, could not get people to fill all the positions. So you have most of the members on the council that are carrying 2 positions. How well does it work when you've got a guy who's working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and he's not only the president of the congregation, but also the evangelism chairman? Something's going to get the short shrift, isn't it? And so if we start talking about how can we do this to be better together, and instead of carrying 2 positions, somebody else has the other one, they can each give their best effort to that particular position. Another part of merging for mission is practicing good stewardship, and I think that's really another one of those bottom lines to think about. Saving money and time and maximizing church facilities. So this is what restarting a congregational is viewed as an exciting new start. So you've got the formation phase, you've got the phase where things stabilize, and then unfortunately over time in every situation, things sort of decline. In the midst of that, you've got ongoing renewal, revitalization, redevelopment. The bottom line, and it's not just doing it. I hope nobody came here this morning with the idea of we're doing this because Synod said so. That's something we've had to dispel in some of the other areas. I was happy talking to both of your pastors. They said this is something that we are talking about internally. Congregations merge because they believe they will be stronger together than on their own. They will believe that the larger critical mass helps them with mission. I'm going to leave that one up there for a second and think about that. Probably a lot of what we've talked about makes sense up here, right? But this is the challenge. I'm not going to ask anybody to raise their hand, but I know enough about this area that I'm guessing you have people who have been members of the congregation for, I'm guessing in some places, 3 and 4 generations. And the congregation, the church that my parents, my grandparents, and perhaps my great-grandparents went to think about that being gone is sometimes difficult here. This slide right here really stuck with me when we had the conversation on the south side of Milwaukee 6 weeks ago, because this was the most common thing I heard. Everybody says when you look at it from a ministry and a head perspective, it makes absolute sense. The president of the congregation, the wife of the president of the congregation that my wife and I belong to said this. She said, I always envisioned that my kids would be baptized and confirmed, and that has happened, and married in the exact same church. There was a gentleman who was sitting behind my wife and I at that meeting, and he said, I viewed that I was going to be baptized, confirmed, married, and buried from the exact same church. And he says, I need to get over the heart part and understand what's better for the church as a whole. So I'm not dissing at all. I want you to understand that if you have the heart struggle, that's a human thing. How do we ask our God to say, let us think with the brains that God has given to us and what makes sense best for the overall mission of Christ Church? Oh, here, everybody's favorite part again. You get to talk to each other. What might be some potential upsides to merging or consolidating congregations? What might be the biggest obstacle? So you've all, from talking to your pastors, this is something that you've all talked about within your own congregations and perhaps a little bit jointly. Okay, now here's the chance with a larger group from both congregations. I'm going to give you again 2 minutes. Talk about that. What might be some of the upsides? What might become some of the challenges? Go on ahead for 2 minutes. Start with the positives, so let's go with the first one. Potential upsides to talking about maybe doing things more together. What exactly does it look like? What are some positives that you have either talked about within your own home or in the conversations this morning that you would like to share with other people? Yes, sir.
We learned at the first meeting with Morrison, they went to the evangelism leadership team thing.
Okay.
We learned that real positive, because we have a hard time at our place getting, people for trustee and that. And it's always hard when you got to pick somebody, go find 2 new trustees, this and that. Everybody turn you down. So they went to that team thing where you got volunteers at, and with more people, it would be a lot easier for that. You'd have more volunteers and that to run your.
So the idea of more people playing football together, and I want to pick up one other thing with that. Maybe you find that there are other skills, right? God does not necessarily distribute the same skills equally to every congregation, right? And maybe God put in one particular congregation individuals who have a strong skill set with it. That's a great first one. I saw another hand over here somewhere. Yes?
Pastor Rudot and Shirley have the gift of the teen leadership. I feel they've done a very good job of bringing that together. That's something that Morrison has unfortunately lacked on in the last 10 years. You can ask my youngest son, right, Pastor Enderle?
He's standing right there, right?
My youngest son was the one kid at Bible class in there. But Morrison's been blessed with the gift of a wonderful school campus with a great faculty at that campus we have embraced that. So I think together the 2 congregations both have something to give everybody forever.
Okay, super. We got 2 volunteers, which is better than we did in the previous 2 discussions, so we're already ahead. And I'm going to keep on going. And I think both of those conversations are example of what we talked about. Sometimes we have to use this and say, okay, even though it's not happening at my congregation or our congregation, doing things jointly together, it makes sense. Other conversations that people have had, positives. I don't want to get to the negative yet, folks, so I'd like to accentuate.
Youth fellowship.
Fellowship, right? So you join things together. And I'm sure that when you've got two congregations that are 7 miles apart, I'm guessing there's a fair amount of people that know each other already, right? You know, maybe you play softball together or other things like this. I'm going to say, I don't know that I've ever done a presentation where I've had people sitting here and folks sitting at the bar going, when can we get done so we can have our Bloody Mary this morning? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Look at where Pastor Schultz is leaning. He's on the end of the bar. And I can pick on him. This is the problem. He knows I can pick on him until the cows come home and have a good time with it. Sorry, Aaron. You knew it was coming, didn't you?
And
Any other positives? I'd like to just find, we got to have one more positive here somewhere. Yes?
Well, we've got relatives.
Okay, relatives, right?
Years ago, you never went more than 7 miles away to get your bride, so everybody
So the idea of that you can't in the state of Wisconsin marry your cousin may have had some challenges in some romantic relationships around here. We'll leave that one lie. But it's the truth, right? Okay, any of the biggest obstacles that we have to overcome? And again, remember, we're among fellow Christians. We're speaking for the mission of the church.
I think on the opposite side of what he just said would be the relatives. I know I came from First Lutheran in Green Bay and that population was huge in my family, okay? And I come out to little Shirley here, and I took note, and I kind of still feel a little bit when you go into other WELS churches or whatever. You feel that pain of, are they going to talk to me? Are they going to say hello? And how are you today? And I took note of that, and I try to make an effort to say hello to someone who may walk into the church and I've never seen them. I still get that feeling even if I'll go out to the West Coast and walk in their church. I get that. The only place probably not was down in Lafayette, Indiana, which is a mission church.
Okay.
Okay. I felt very comfortable with those people, maybe because there were quite a few people from Wisconsin. I don't know. Maybe that might have some bearing. But that's what I find as a negativity in the WELS.
You all know each other so well, and sometimes letting people from the outside in, and again, maybe it's not intentional, right? But you know all these other people, and for crying out loud, you haven't seen each other in 7 days. You got to catch up on what happened in the last 7 days, right?
I can, it's kind of a joke on that one is they say sometimes in Morrison in the basement you can draw a circle of where the relatives gather. Like
This is their corner, this is
that
their
corner, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's some truth to that.
Go ahead.
Just a comment, but there's been members, myself, that, and I know there's other ones in here, but, so we initially started out when we moved here, and we were members at Shirley, and then we had children, and then we came to Morrison, so, I think it's really cool because I just went and gave hugs to, some of my friends from back then, but with the whole merger thing, it's just like if anybody would have any kind of internal animosity or any thoughts about, well, why you left and went over to Morrison, but just because I know that there's a number of people that have come over for different reasons, but again, it's what's best for the mission and get your own personal heart out of it. So
It's all this, right? That is so true. When you were talking about people, going into a church, I'll give you my wife's perspective. More often than not, when I guest preach somewhere else, my wife comes with me. And I watched, and she finally explained it to me. She doesn't sit down until the last minute because heaven forbid she sits in somebody else's pew. Right? And again, none of this, I don't think any of this is intentional. We are creatures of habit, right? Some people are going, hey, that pew toward the back on the right-hand side, that guy just went to heaven. All of a sudden, that pew became available. Now he can move back a little bit. And again, it's all these things where when we think about things in the perspective of the mission of the church, maybe we have to stop for a minute, lay our own personal preferences aside, and go, what can I do for the greater good of God's kingdom. And again, I applaud all of you. The fact that you are here this morning and being a part of this conversation is a fantastic thing. Any more challenges? Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to do one more just because it was talked about around me. Another challenge is probably financially. How do you support each church and school? How does that work? Do you share? Do you not share? The one thing I think we all need to keep in mind is God did promise that he would always provide. So however that happens, it's in his hands. And we shouldn't worry about the little things like that.
But at the same time, I'm going to go back for a second. Right there, right? Sometimes, God gave us this for a reason, right? And sometimes we need to say, hey, maybe if we're struggling, if we join together, the stewardship part of it might be a little bit better. Any on either side? Man, you guys, you've doubled the conversation that we had the last two, so kudos. I'm going to give you a chance to break way ahead. Positive or negative, any that anybody wants to talk about. Let the microphone come to you, please. Thank you.
I know the Lord provides for us. He always has, and he's provided for my family, my loved ones. But what do you do with these buildings when they're empty? I mean, I know that's not, maybe it's from the heart and brain, but what happens to them? Do you have a plan for that, or how does that go?
Fantastic question, right? Especially when it's a building that, how many WELS congregations have, okay, this particular stained glass window has a brass plate under it because it was given by my, great-grandparents in memory of my great-great-grandparents or something else like that. On the way back home yesterday, and my wife said, she goes, it was fun listening to all this. I had 3 different phone conversations on the way back. And one of them was with a classmate of mine, and we were talking about something totally unrelated, and I said to him, so this is up in the Wausau area. Exactly what you're talking about, ma'am. They had 3 churches, and they consolidated them into one. One of those, the couple took and turned into a house. The other one, somebody took and turned into an Airbnb. It's interesting. That is one of those biggest things, and then sometimes, I don't know if it's the situation with any of these out here. I know there's one up in Minnesota, so that's actually where John Hine is this morning, because you have 20-some congregations in the Twin Cities area. Not to lay down the gauntlet or anything, but you multiply times 10 the congregations that we have here this morning. You got 20-some congregations in the Twin Cities area that are having this conversation this morning. And I know one of those congregations, the thing that is making the conversation the most difficult, what do many of those old congregations have abutting right up next to the church property? Cemetery. What's going to happen to grandma and grandpa, and those types of things. And again, those are sometimes things that we have to talk about. So to that point, it's interesting that in most of those situations, they've not had a hard time getting rid of them. It's interesting how people want to take a church and turn it into a house or an Airbnb. Understand that for 13 years, I served probably, I think, about 50 miles straight south of here at Faith in Fond du Lac. We had not a WELS church, but another Lutheran church in town. They, surprise, surprise, merged and built on another site outside of town, and the old church downtown became a restaurant. I will tell you, it was very weird the first time I went into that restaurant, and guess where they put the bar? Right up in the altar area. It made it very awkward stepping up there to get a drink when I'm going, okay, this is the place where people used to receive the body and blood of my Savior. But again, though, I'm going to borrow because that's where a lot of the stuff came from. John Hines, another one of his favorite lines. Don, we hear a lot of these, don't we? Way too many? One of his favorite lines is that when the Lord comes back, all this earthly stuff is going to be mere kindling. It's not, but again, that's getting, moving this from here to there, right? Okay, the church that my family has worshiped in for 3, 4, maybe 5 generations. or the church that my grandfather helped build or something else like that. That's something we need to get back past. Anything else on this one? Some fantastic points. Again, we're going to show you how to start some of those conversations when we get to the end here. Different types of mergers, an absorption merger. So that's where you take perhaps 4 congregations and they merge into one. Look at the proximity of those 4 churches. Remember the stat that I told you earlier, the percentage of WELS congregations that are within 10 minutes of each other that worship under 50 people. I was glad I had a conversation with your pastors, and again, I'm glad it's starting with these 2 congregations. But you go back to those 2 maps that I showed you at the beginning. As this conversation gets rolling, do you, in the interest of the mission of the church, perhaps reach out to others in the area? And I can tell you from experience, that's exactly how things got started on the south side of Milwaukee. We had one gentleman, not from the congregation that my wife and I belong to, but from one of the other congregations. He had been trying for 4 and 5 years to start the conversation. And it's finally when we said, hey, let's get all 7 together. The interesting thing is those 7, and I know talking to the 2 pastors, you got to look at crossing circuits and perhaps conference lines and those types of things. That's mere earthly boundaries. The interesting thing is those 7 congregations on the south side of Milwaukee, that's our circuit. And it's interesting how everybody's going, yeah, we probably should have had this conversation 5 years ago. And now God's finally kicking us in the butt and we're getting it done. So that's the absorption merger. Everybody goes together at one point. Another one is the restart merger. I applaud you. I sort of smiled when I got the invitation to come up here because I said, you guys are doing the exact same thing that we did on the south side. One of the pieces of advice that we got was don't have that meeting at any one of the particular churches. Because whether you think about it or not, somebody might have a perceived home court advantage. Okay? So instead of saying, okay, why did we have to go to that church instead of staying at our church? Everybody says we're going to give up our 4 and we're going to start at a new location. A multi-site merger. So instead of everybody going to one, instead of everybody going to a bunch of different places, do perhaps 2 work together. Anybody see some strange similarities to the conversation we're having this morning? You got 2 congregations talking about perhaps doing together. Or do you have one church, multiple sites? And again, that's not something that's uncommon across the synod. Different multi-site types, so it might be that, okay, this church had church on Saturday evening, this church had one service on Sunday morning, this church had service on Monday evening. How do we do that to, recognizing people's schedules and everything else, offer people perhaps more opportunities to worship based on work schedules and lifestyle and things like that? The one on the far right, I don't know about you, but I'm just going to, personal preference, I don't know if that one, where you have the guy at one place and it's video broadcast out to other places. That's not exactly personal, is it? But it's just, again, it's an option. Strategic variations. So you take them all together and you take one of the names. Oh boy, isn't that a challenge, trying to pick a name. Or you take all 3 and you say, okay, we're going to have a completely different name. Here's an example of this. I've talked about the south side of Milwaukee. Understand that within about 20 minutes of where my wife and I live, there are 3 of these mergers that have taken place in the last 2 years. You've got one down in Kenosha where you had 5 congregations. They kept 3 sites. They're doing things in different places. You had one in Racine where 2 churches joined to become one, and they're offering different ministries on different sites. And then you've got this one. How many of you ventured down toward the big city of Milwaukee once in a while? I know you folks probably go more to Green Bay, okay? I'm just going to use as a point of reference. So if you go down 41, You have the intersection of 41 and 94 of the Milwaukee County Zoo. Maybe most of you know where that is, okay? You go exactly 1 mile south of the Milwaukee County Zoo, and you had two churches that were kitty corner across the interstate from one another. Some of you may have seen that. You get through the zoo interchange, and there's Good Shepherd on the right side. You got to really look to see Woodlawn on the east side. And then you had Jordan just a little bit down the way. Understand with this one, they actually had a fourth site that before the conversation even happened, that site ended up closing. These three merged together. Back to the question that was asked earlier, I don't know what happened to it, but I know they very easily sold the Jordan site. Now you've got Good Shepherd and Woodlawn together, 2 miles across, so a little bit closer than you guys. And now they're rebranded as Living Hope Lutheran Church.
There's a fourth church, that one that closed. They are now Lighthouse. I don't know if you're going to.
They're now an extension of St. Paul's Muskego, exactly.
And used for ministry to youth. So that building's being used in really good ways.
Yeah, great point. So here's the interesting thing. Guess what Good Shepherd and Woodlawn both had? Schools. So here's what they did. They moved the school campus all to Woodlawn because Woodlawn had the bigger school facility. Here's the very interesting part about it, and I know enough folks in there that I know some inside stuff. Neither place had a worship facility large enough to seat everybody from both congregations merged together. So they took the gym at Good Shepherd. Any of you who are in construction going, oh my, this is a nightmare. Trying to take a gym and convert it into a nice looking worship facility. That's what they're in the process of doing. They had looked at, they had actually talked about joining together and buying another campus, but they couldn't find one that would work for them. Here's the other thing in this. So this merger just happened about a year ago. Where do you think their worship attendance went in the last year, the two congregations combined? Up or down? What are you thinking? 10% increase in overall worship attendance by joining the two congregations together. So what happened with that is both congregations, the two big ones, Good Shepherd and Woodlawn, each had two pastors. Jordan had one. One of the pastors retired, so now you've got three pastors utilizing their strengths and focusing on different areas. So this is just one example. I told you I could give you more information if you want about the Racine one or the Kenosha one about how those things took place. I alluded to this earlier. Top 3 reasons mergers fail. We lost sight of the mission and we were only concerned about the dollars. We need to be good stewards and be concerned about it, but remember the very first thing we talked about this morning. It all comes back to mission and being witnesses, making sure that we're doing both discipleship and evangelism. A shared vision was never developed. Trying to get everybody together on the exact same page. We all agree, regardless of how my heart might feel about this or that, we all agree for the good of the kingdom, this is how we're going together and we're going to give it our best effort. There was persistent, nostalgic looking back rather than looking forward. I think you can see how that might be a challenge, right? You know, we had to give up this or, you know, the example I shared with you earlier, the lady that said, I thought we were going back to the glory days. And like I said, her pastor tried not to snicker and going, he told me, he goes, unfortunately, I don't think she realizes the glory days are not coming back and we got to figure out how we're going to do things going forward. Take a minute and talk among you. Do you want me to go back to the types of mergers just so you have it? I'll go back a second just so we've got these. So the different types of mergers. Absorption, where you've got 4 into 1. Restart, 4 new site because we think that's the best for everybody. Or the multi-site merger where we join and we have dual ministries, 1 church, 2 locations, and that type of thing. I'll give you a minute to go on ahead and have that conversation among yourselves, and then we'll move on from there. And make sure you take note of the first word in that discussion. Everything this morning is if. We are not saying we're doing anything, we're simply exploring, and I think that's an important thing to remember. Only opinion, and there is never a bad opinion. I'm going to invoke one more John Hine quote this morning. John Hine, at the congregation he was at in South Carolina, he said, if you ever bash someone's idea without coming up with an alternative solution, you were banned from ever speaking in the meeting, congregational meeting again. Think about how folks pick their words very carefully. Any ideas about what you think about what might be? Again, I stress that word if. Ideas of how might this whole thing possibly go? Who's got a dream that they would like to share with the group this morning? Let the microphone come to you, please, sir.
So I have an alternative solution.
Okay.
If you're open to it.
Anything's on the table.
Okay, to review, Morrison has been blessed with a good campus that just didn't happen by chance. I know a while back we were going to build on, and I remember, the financial thing. How are we going to do this? This small congregation, how are we going to build on the cost? I remember Pastor Ott saying, think big, and we did. We had a drive. We got it done. So I'm thinking big here for this situation.
Go for it.
Okay, Morrison has the campus that we have. What Shirley has is they have the potential out there with the growth in their area to go bigger. So my proposal would be to start out like we were talking about starting out a preschool at Shirley. And then we have Morrison as a school right now. To think you want to increase the members of the churches, right?
Yep.
So my thought is we look at Morrison supporting Shirley to get bigger. Support like their school. They build on the school. In the meantime, as their daycare gets bigger, and then their school they could start building. Meanwhile, the children could go to Morrison, but Shirley could grow bigger. And the whole idea is to increase God's church members here on earth. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you for sharing. Appreciate it. Okay. Up here in the front, Pastor Enderle.
Okay. Just like he said, I think a dual partnership in utilizing Shirley as like a preschool or whatever. Number one being, if we would just do one central site, the growth is coming from Denmark, coming from the east side, the Bellevue, coming from Ledgeview. And if you're looking at that 15-mile, whatever, 10-minute ride, if we would do one church, and then you got to expand that.
Right.
I think doing a dual purpose, doing the two services, maybe one through the week time or in the evening on a Saturday, or doing a Sunday. But I feel we have to look at that growth that's coming from Denmark. Their church there in Denmark, I'm not sure what it's like anymore, but it is shrinking. We want to pull people again. We want to bring them back. And that's happened before. Pine Grove closing. I know it's been many years. Some went to Denmark, some went to Shirley. I wasn't part of it, but we want to continue that growth, I think, going north and east
Okay.
and west, so that's my feeling.
somewhat a little bit connected, but two different ideas there. Any other ideas, dreams, visions? Not that we're saying we're seeing visions here this morning, but you're visioning. And I say that because we're going to get to that in a second. Ready to move on? I'll allow some time for questions at the end. Here's where we go with determining next steps. So this morning is the start of phase one. And listening to your two pastors, I think some of that has happened already. But the whole idea, we got another idea.
Yeah, we got one more.
I think that they should combine both of them and make one school building and then have the church connected.
Okay. So there you've got the young opinion. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Back to what I was saying. Listening to what your pastors have said, I think some of the exploration has happened already, and I think that makes this conversation that much easier. The handout that you're going to get is going to give you some more details. So the next part of exploration is you going back in your own individual homes and in your own congregations and starting that conversation and saying, are we in agreement that we want to somehow move this forward? And I say that clearly because that has been the biggest challenge on the south side of Milwaukee. Understand, I'm the guy who's got the connection to congregational services, so I get asked the question all the time. And understand with 7, everybody's not going to move at the same pace, right? Some are the turtle, some are the rabbit, and everybody's not necessarily going at the same pace. And I got all the rabbits going, why aren't the turtles catching up to us? And I'm going, hold on a second. Be respectful of your brothers and sisters in Christ. Let them have their conversation. So that's the exploration phase. When you agree, hey, we want to move forward, the next step would be envisioning. I'm going to show you in a minute what that looks like. And then the third phase becomes, okay, there's no turning back. We are saying we are doing whatever, regardless of what my own personal opinion is, for the good of the kingdom, I'm all in. This is what we're going to do. Envisioning. So if you say, hey, we really want to move forward, look at all these, and I think we've talked about some of these already. I know we've talked about facility. I know we've talked about school. I know we've talked about ministry. And remember we said we've got folks who have relatives in both, and maybe they belong to one and then now they belong to the other. So this is getting representatives from each congregation to populate those committees, and then you've got one individual from each of those committees that form an executive committee that sort of help guide this whole thing. What you are getting this morning is not the handbook. If you decide, hey, we want to move to step 2 and we want some guidance with this, and it's not quite done yet. Remember this, you guys you're on the cutting edge of this happening in our synod. So some of this not that we're making it up as we go, but we're figuring out, hey, we've got to provide more resources. So there's actually going to be a handbook that gives each committee some things to talk about. You know, you've got governance. How do we, maybe one church does their voters meetings and understand, that's some of the conversation. Do we continue with voters meeting? Do we look at a different governance model? I will tell you as a heads up, there's a whole new constitution that's going to come out sometime this summer that's going to talk about looking at, do we need to have, I'm guessing both congregations have it written in their church constitution. You must have a voters meeting every single quarter. And then you got the 5 or 12, okay, so you're past that, okay? But understand, that used to be the old model, right? You have to have the voters meeting, and the same 10 guys showed up every single quarter and said, why are we doing this? We got to find a way to do things better, so that's part of it. Ministry, finance, finance has been talked about several times this morning. I know we've talked about facility. I know we've talked about school. So that would be the envisioning phase. Understand, with this, you can still turn back. This is just simply saying, how do we possibly see this going? We bring it to both congregations and then that type of thing. And then, so congregation decision whether to proceed with phase 2, phase 3, that's where we actually, so to speak, pull the trigger and say, we all agree for the good of the kingdom, This is what we are going to do together, and this is how we are going to carry it out. And understand, that I know with some of these mergers, what has happened is they presented one idea, everybody brought it together, and they had some conversation, and maybe they changed it a little bit. Maybe the end product did not exactly look like the leadership group had envisioned it, but that's where you take the collective wisdom and skill of everybody and say, in the long run, what's the best for the kingdom as a whole? So the bigger handout that you're going to get when you leave is going to give you all these details. The interesting thing is, the funny thing is after we had the one 6 weeks ago, and when we started talking about your meeting this morning, John goes, I should have had a handout. Because there was a whole lot of questions as people were leaving, how do we do this next? You are going to have the benefit of that. You're going to have all that stuff in front of you. You can continue to reach out for us and ask for any clarification or things like that. What is needed? Interesting. Has anybody seen this illustration before? Awesome. Nobody's seen that. Can go on ahead. Okay, you look at that type of thing. And just have a 30-second conversation. I'm going to give you the explanation, and then you're going to have a 30-second conversation. What would you think about if that were the wheelbarrow that you were handed to haul a whole bunch of concrete? Go on ahead and talk among your neighbors. Positives and negatives. And you're going, what? Think about how you might make it work and what are the possible challenges. Okay, I remember the first time I saw this one, I was sitting on the other side and I'm going, what? Okay, here's some of the comments that were made as this was shown to a group of people who I'm going to reveal to you in a second. You're close to the wheel, I guess if it got muddy you could knock the mud off. Great observation, right? The handle's really short, but it would be easier to lift if you need to pick the wheelbarrow up and carry it somewhere. What if you had a trap door at the bottom? It would be good for filling holes. Somebody's thinking, right? Those are all comments made by a bunch of second graders. Guess what? This is actually a wheelbarrow that was, you had someone helping build a skyscraper in the city of Chicago. And what they did is there was a chain that was attached to that short little handle. The wheel ran up at the side of the building, and guess what was at the bottom of the wheelbarrow? A trap door to be able to dump the concrete in it. Curiosity is needed. I've stressed this earlier, but now it's in writing for you to see it. The best part about this is, and I want you all to hear this, and I want you all to take this back to your home and your congregation. Everybody has to be able to express new ideas, even if they challenge the status quo. And there are never any sacred cows in two congregations that have a little bit of history, are there? Maybe one or two. Everyone must look for the kernel of good in the new idea rather than immediately looking to shoot holes in it. So be open to. You look at the range of opinions we had. I was grateful that we had a young opinion here to talk about things. Everybody can share their opinion, and what do we decide collectively to move forward together? Okay, we're going to go through this exercise rather quickly. Look at that picture for just a few seconds. And take note of what you see in it. Okay, what did you see there? Quickly, let's go through this. What did you see in that picture that stuck out to you? Pardon? The car. Statue of Liberty. Somebody else? Which one? Apple. Okay. I'm going to give it to you again, and now I'm going to narrow the focus a little bit. Look for the things that are blue in the picture. Okay, what did you see that was blue? The blue was probably the most obvious one, right? How many saw the car? How many saw the airplane? How many saw the picture of Pastor Aaron Steinbrenner hidden at the bottom? Look underneath the stop sign. That's just sort of sitting there, right? And poor Pastor Aaron Steinbrenner got ignored. Okay, right? It all depends upon what your focus is and that type of thing. And that reminds us, as we start having this conversation more, focus is needed. Focus on the mission. What matters, Christ's mission, Christ's glory. We gotta leave our personal preferences on the side. People continually distinguish between the means and the end, okay? Once we set out what that end goal is, and that's where the handbook will help you figure out what are the means to get there. You ever been a part of a conversation where someone wants to get everything done and they forget about taking the necessary steps along the way? Who knows how quickly this might move? Just knowing the different merger situations, some of them happen relatively quickly. The one in West Allis, think about that. Getting one congregation closing, selling another campus, and combining 3 churches into one on 2 campuses, that all happened in 6 months. The decision to do it happened in 6 months. Now exactly how that is being carried out is something that they are working through. Balance and mission, we started talking about that this morning. I've heard that talked about. Challenges posed by statistical decline. I think somebody said that, that we're losing young people and those types of things. Upside and obstacles, what might be both sides. We've talked about that, types of mergers, the process. In the interest of your time and knowing that you have schedules and also that I have a premarital counseling meeting to get to, but there's no schedule. I told the bride, I said, I'll be there when I get there, I'll let you know. So it's not about my schedule. It's the interest of yours, but I recognize you may have things. Anything that anybody would like to either ask or express for the good of the whole or for the entire group here this morning. Anything that is just you're itching to talk about, or a question that we did not answer in the presentation this morning. Wait for the microphone, please, sir.
At Shirley, we were blessed for several years to have a sister congregation that we worked with Greenleaf. And over the years, they just gradually went away. I mean, you had a statistic before that in 20 years, if we do nothing, 50% of us will probably be gone. In fact, in this group, I'd venture to say in 20 years, 50% of us probably won't be here.
There's a fair amount, right? Exactly, yep.
Okay, so Greenleaf dissolved. Now Shirley, with no school, is kind of in the same situation. In 20 years, where will we be? And Morrison is not exempt. We lost our school at Shirley. In 20, 40 years, who knows where it'll end. So I'm not so sure doing nothing is a real solution.
That's an excellent point. If we do nothing, we're not serving the kingdom, right? I think we can all agree on that. That the conversation is, what do we do instead? Excellent point. And what did you do? You used history to illustrate that. Now, what does the next step look like? Thank you.
In listening to the conversation that's gone on so far, ideally, one campus would be most economical, but a dual campus has a lot of potential. The other thing that Morrison's currently looking through is a second pastor. If we're going to continue looking at some type of a merger, being either single or dual, it probably would not be the worst idea to put calls on the hold until we see where this goes. Because if for some reason we get a second pastor, I think it'd be more difficult. Because Pastor Radat has been preaching to us a little bit. We've enjoyed that. And if there is any type of merge, I think we have 2 very good pastors that can serve both campuses. So I guess my suggestion would be that if there is our call meetings, we'd probably keep on hold until we make some type of determination where we're going with this.
Okay, thank you. Other comments or questions over here?
Hey folks, good morning. I'm Steve. I'm on the leadership team over at Morrison Zion. My encouragement to everyone here sitting on the leadership team, I know I can't represent all of your opinions, So my huge ask, as you take this homework, please take it seriously. Talk to the people who aren't here. We can't lead if we don't understand kind of where you're at. We won't have all the ideas. And so your feedback is so huge and critical in this process. We have a tendency as good German Lutherans to be quiet. I think we warmed up over some time, but I would strongly encourage you not to be quiet. I know I will not have all the ideas you have. I know neither the church council at Shirley probably will either. So please be vocal. Please write things down. You don't have to speak up in this group if you don't want to, but we possibly as leaders can't come up with all the ideas. We really need to hear from you. So that's my encouragement as we leave here today. Whatever you think is right, we really want to hear from you.
What's the recommendation that, we go home, we have some thoughts for both churches. My question to Steve is, we go home, we have thoughts, we have ideas. What are both churches going to tell their members? Are we going to set up an email for this, or how are we going to message this back to our leadership teams in the churches?
I'll let the two pastors talk about it. Have you guys talked about that, how you're going to disseminate information?
Hi, I'm Pastor Dave Rudot. I think for Emmanuel and Shirley, there are going to be some handouts that you take home that we are encouraging you to fill out, and then we have our voters meeting is coming up in April. We do the voters meeting system, so we'll have a voters meeting coming up in April. So then my thinking, where our council doesn't meet till tomorrow, but my thinking was that we would have some sort of open forum just to talk about this issue, because we have other issues to talk about. We would have an open forum so that we would bring all of the things that, all of the handouts that people have signed up, or as Pastor Enderle has come up with a Google form, so we could put all this information in an electronic format, gather all the information, then have the open forum in Emmanuel's congregation, and then have our April voters meeting, we'll talk more about what to do, should we do the next step.
Yeah, and I think we can have more questions, but what I'll say with the handout, so we do have that handout that he was talking about, and it has a lot of those questions that were asked of you, including some other ones. What I did though is, I'd say on the back page is kind of the next step thing is, it says, after working through this document, do you believe your congregation should proceed to phase 2 of the Merge for Mission program? I think that's our initial thought of saying we want critical mass. We want enough people saying yes to that. And if you don't want to do it digitally, filling that out and returning that. And I think we'll set a date. I don't know if we want to say 2 weeks, but we know that there are several people that couldn't be here for this. So at Morrison, we're also going to set up a time to watch this and then have more discussion locally as well. Because we have, there's there's about half the leadership team that really wanted to be at this meeting, but we couldn't set up a date until later, and we wanted to get this discussion going. So that's one of the reasons we're recording this. So, so when this gets handed out, I think that's the essential question is, do we want to go forward? Do we want to go to phase 2 and having that returned? What I'd probably encourage is putting your name and what church you're from. If you're returning it to your pastor, then it'll maybe be easy to do that. But online, on this, and then even on the forums there, is that digital version. And what I did for that is I put only that first 2 questions on there as the first part. And if all you want to do is say that, like continue yes or no, and you can submit that. And then after that, though, if you want to answer more, it has all of these other questions that you can give other information, other feedback about blessings, challenges. But I also wanted to make it easy, so if instead of opening up that form and there's like 20 questions, you're like, oh, I have to answer all this. No, if you want to just say yes, I want to encourage this. I want to give a voice to say this is a good idea. That's a very simple, put my name, click this, say yes, and submit. But then if you want to give more feedback about different ideas, that is available to you.
To follow up on that and to save Pastor Enderle and Pastor Rudot from getting the exact same question that I've gotten for the last 6 weeks, because I know this is probably what everybody's wondering. If both congregations say yes, the next step would be with both congregations reaching out to Pastor Hine. I don't know if it's going to be him, if it's going to be me, if it's going to be somebody else from our Congregational Services team, would be another meeting to then explain in more depth step number 2, okay? And understand that even if you say yes to step number 2, you're still not married. You can still change your mind. And again, not saying that you're going to, I just listen to the conversation. I think there's definitely a desire to move forward. But that would be, because I know that's the big question a lot of people have is, okay, if we say yes, what does that mean? So, question, comment? We have another comment over there? Okay, so does that give you a better idea of where we're going from here? 2 things just to let you know. So you heard that the video will be available. The other thing, as soon as we're done here, I'm going to PDF the PowerPoint, and I'm going to make that available to everybody too, because that was the other. I know there's a lot of stuff that was thrown at you this morning. I know you couldn't necessarily see some of the finer points of the statistics and those types of things. Question in the back, Pastor Enderle. I'll let those guys talk about that. That's beyond my pay grade.
It's a video. When are you going to show that?
The question is, when is the video going to be showed? We haven't set the date on that yet. I think we'll set that up fairly soon, though.
Over on the end, we got another question.
I think something too to think about, or that wasn't talked about, do you have any statistics on when you merge churches, do you find that you lose members from those congregations? Because I think that's something that needs to be thought about also.
Yes, but it's relatively small. You know, there may be some, and again, you know, hopefully it's not in disgust, why on earth do we do this? But maybe somebody decides, just for the good of my family or for my spiritual health or whatever, I'm going to go elsewhere. What we have not seen is a huge loss. It's somewhere between maybe a 3 and a 5% loss. But remember the other statistics that I talked about, that, you know, the overall, you know, what's the ultimate goal? Continuing to encourage those who are part of Christ's kingdom and reaching out to those who are not. And when you see statistically a growth in, you know, worship and discipleship overall and combining, it's been a net positive. Good enough? Okay, thank you. Great. I'm glad I was hoping somebody was going to ask that question, because, again, that's not a negative. We also need to understand the realities. But I want to follow up on that, say that should not hold you back. You know, when you look at overall, you know, remember, head versus heart. You need to think head, you know, and mission of the Christ Church and that type of thing. Pastor Enderle.
I've been at a couple presentations of this at different conferences about churches that have merged, and pastors have expressed, like, from time to time there's a family that says, oh, you know, like, well, we don't like this, you know, we're going to leave or whatever. After they see everything, most of the time they don't do that. They kind of see, they see the purpose, they see the reasons, they see what blessings are from this. And so part of that's on us also to explain what are we doing and why and what are the blessings. So I think the prayer is that as we explain, I think some of the encouragement was what's the vision? You know, having it all laid out. And if you lay out the vision, if you explain how this can be a blessing, just like anything, are you going to make everyone happy? You know, we know in everything we do, not every single person is going to be happy with every decision. But I think if you're doing it for Christ, for the gospel, and it's explained clearly, then hopefully you can win over some of those people that are like, why are we doing this? Or we don't need to do this. So I'd say that's, for the most part, very, very few people that have done this have said we've lost anything. In fact, they usually gain and then gain in the weekly attendance.
Super, thank you. Yes, one over here. And I hate to cut it off, but I'm going to, just for the interest and respect for everybody, we're going to make this the last question. I got a few wrap-up things.
It's not so much a question, it's just something I have observed through the course of the years. Even though our school closed and we've moved forward, the one thing is Morrison School has always been there. Some also could have gone to St. John's and Maribel.
those schools are available to all family members, and they still are there today. The encouragement needs to be with the families who are not just connected to Zion's church, that they can be encouraged to go to the school. And that's where I think we need to focus also, is to encourage those families to send them there, okay? Also, they may think, well, I have to take them to school. As they age, the bus system is there. I know for a fact. I just lived, I can see the church. Okay, our kids were picked up all the time, and I thought, wow, why? You know, are they going to be picked up to go to school? Just for they could walk easily. But the fact is, they are available. We should try to encourage that from Shirley. And I don't know if that focus of family members have. I know I'm trying to do with my own family, but that's where I think the Shirley members need to also focus. Just because it closed, there's still education available.
Okay, super,
So-
thank you. I'm going to say this first so I don't forget to say it at the end, because we're going to close with prayer in a second. If you were not somebody who said, I want to stand up in front of 100 people on a Saturday morning, and you got a question, I'm going to stick around for a while. I already warned the bride. I said, Taylor, I'll let you know when I get there. And she said, fine. I got to quick tell you, this was the interesting story. This young lady's wedding is 7 weeks away. And something happened. She's in between churches, and she's a kindergarten classmate of our son. So I understand these young people are both now 30 years old. And about a week ago, her dad reached out and said, help. You remember? I'm like, yeah, I remember Taylor. Can you do her wedding? So she knows that I sort of got the upper hand and say, you can wait for a second. So I can stick around as long as I need to. Second thing, thank you. This is just an awesome thing to see this many people take time out of a Saturday morning to come together and to do this. Pastor Endley, where are the handouts going to be?
We'll put them in the back.
Okay, so don't forget to grab one of those handouts. Please do not let that word homework scare you at all. This is good homework for the good of the kingdom. It's education and that type of thing. That all having been said, let's wrap things up with prayer. Gracious God, we first of all thank you that you have given each of us the gift of faith in Jesus as our Savior. We thank you that you have brought us into individual congregations. Most of all, Lord, we thank you that you have made us a part of the Holy Christian Church, the group of all believers. We ask that you bless everyone here this morning, that you bless the members of Emmanuel, you bless the members of Zion, you bless the collective conversation that goes forward for the good of your kingdom, knowing that you will do what is best, as your will is always done in the greatest and best way. We humbly ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. Have a great day.